Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Um, Today we're going to be talking about something that is super interesting to me, at least I think you're going to find it really interesting too.
Yeah, this should be a good one.
It's clinical trials for cannabinoid therapies.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a hot topic these days.
It is, and it's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't really know much about. They hear about cannabis, they hear about CBD and all that,
Yeah.
and I think it can be kind of a mystery, like how do these things actually get studied?
Right, exactly. I mean, it's a whole different world than, traditional pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to dive into today. And with
Yeah.
me to help unpack all of this is uh, an expert in the field.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's just jump right in. One of the things that I find really fascinating about this whole area is that it's so different from traditional drug development. I mean, you think about how most medications are developed, and it's all very precise. You have a pill, you have a specific dose, and it's all very controlled.
Yeah, that's the goal at least.
Right. But with cannabinoid therapies, it's a whole different ballgame
It is, for sure.
because you're dealing with plant-derived compounds, right?
Yeah, you've got all that natural variability to think about.
So how does that variability actually impact clinical trials? I mean, is that a major hurdle for researchers?
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the biggest challenges we face. Because think about it, if you're trying to study the effects of a specific cannabinoid like CBD or THC, you need to make sure that every single participant in your trial is getting the same dose of that compound every time.
Right, like consistency is key.
Exactly. And with plants, you're dealing with so many different factors that can affect the final product, the soil, the climate, the growing conditions, the extraction method. All of these things can influence the cannabinoid content.
So it's like even if you're using the same strain of cannabis, you can end up with different results.
Exactly. It's like trying to bake a cake and using a different type of flour every time.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Your cake is going to turn out differently every time.
So how do researchers actually tackle that challenge? I mean, how do they ensure consistency in dosing when they're dealing with this inherent variability?
Well, there are a few key strategies that they use. One is to standardize the extraction process as much as possible.
Okay, so it's like creating a recipe for the extraction.
Exactly. You want to make sure that you're using the same method every time so that you're extracting the same compounds in the same proportions.
Makes sense.
And then another really important tool is analytical testing.
Oh, so like testing the final product.
Exactly. They use techniques like high-performance liquid chromatography, which is a mouthful, but basically it's a way to separate and quantify the different compounds in a sample.
So they can actually see how much of each cannabinoid is present.
Yep, and that allows them to adjust the dosage accordingly to ensure that everyone is getting the same amount.
Wow, so it's like a constant process of testing and adjusting.
It is, and it's not easy, but it's absolutely essential if you want to have reliable results from your clinical trials.
So you've got the dosing figured out, but then what about the people actually taking the medicine? I mean, I feel like there's still a lot of stigma around cannabis, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that stigma can definitely have an impact on patient compliance.
Like people might be hesitant to participate in a trial, or they might not take the medication as directed.
Exactly. They might be worried about being judged, or they might have misconceptions about the effects of cannabis.
So how do researchers address that? I mean, how do they make sure that people are comfortable and willing to participate in these trials?
Well, education is a big part of it.
Okay, so like making sure people understand what the trial is about and what the potential risks and benefits are.
Exactly. And also addressing any concerns or misconceptions that they might have.
Right, because I imagine there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Oh, there's tons. And it can be really hard to sift through all of it. So researchers need to be really clear and transparent about what they're doing and why.
And I guess it's also about creating a safe and supportive environment for participants, right?
Absolutely. People need to feel comfortable talking about their experiences and asking questions without fear of judgment.
So it's not just about the science, it's about the human element too.
Exactly. It's about building trust and rapport with the participants.
Okay, so we've talked about dosing and patient compliance, but there's another big challenge that I want to touch on, and that's product consistency.
Right. So we've tackled making sure each dose is the same, but what about making sure each batch is the same?
Exactly, because even if you've got the dosing down pat, if the product itself is inconsistent from batch to batch, that's going to throw off your results, right?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. You're trying to study the effects of a specific cannabinoid formulation, but if that formulation is different every time you produce it,
You're basically starting from scratch with each new batch.
exactly, your results are going to be all over the place.
So how do they even begin to tackle that? I mean, are they literally testing every single plant?
Well, not every single plant, but they do have very rigorous quality control measures in place.
Okay, so like what kind of measures are we talking about?
Well, for starters, they have to make sure that the starting material is consistent. So they'll often work with specific suppliers who can provide them with standardized plant material.
Okay, so like sourcing from the same place every time.
Exactly. And then they'll do a lot of testing throughout the entire manufacturing process.
So it's like a multi-step process.
It is. They'll test the raw material, they'll test the extracts, they'll test the final product, and they'll even do stability testing to make sure that the product remains consistent over time.
Wow, so it's a lot of testing.
It is, but it's necessary to ensure that the product is as consistent as possible.
And that consistency is what allows them to draw meaningful conclusions from their research, right?
Exactly. If you don't have a consistent product, you can't be sure that any effects you observe are actually due to the treatment and not just variations in the product itself.
Right, because otherwise it's like you're comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly. You need to make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Okay, so we've talked about dosing, patient compliance, and product consistency. But there's one more big hurdle that I want to bring up, and that's placebo control.
Ah, yes, the
Yeah.
placebo effect.
It's a tricky one, especially when you're dealing with something like cannabis, because some of the cannabinoids, like THC, have very noticeable effects.
Right. It's not like giving someone a sugar pill and telling them it's a painkiller.
Exactly. I mean,
Ex-
people are going to know if they're getting the real deal or not.
Right. And that can make it really difficult to design placebo-controlled trials because if the participants know they're getting the active treatment, they might be more likely to report positive effects.
Or if they know they're getting the placebo disease, they might be more likely to report negative effects.
Exactly. It's a real challenge.
So how do researchers even begin to address that?
Well, it's not easy, but there are a few things they can try. One is to use a placebo that mimics some of the sensory effects of cannabis.
So like something that tastes or smells like cannabis, but doesn't actually contain any active cannabinoids.
Exactly that way, the participants might not be able to tell whether they're getting the real thing or not.
Oh, that's clever. But I imagine it's pretty hard to find a placebo that truly mimics the experience of cannabis.
It is. There's a lot of research going on in that area trying to develop better placebo formulations.
And then what about those crossover designs, where participants get both the treatment and the placebo at different points in the trial? Does that make things even more complicated?
It can, because with crossover designs, you have to worry about carryover effects.
Meaning like the effects of the first treatment might linger and influence the results of the second treatment.
Exactly. So researchers have to be very careful about the washout period, the time between treatments.
So like they need to make sure that the effects of the first treatment have completely worn off before they start the second treatment.
Exactly. And with cannabinoids, that can be tricky because some of them can stay in the body for quite a while.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're trying to juggle all these different factors at once.
It is. It's a real balancing act.
But I guess that's the nature of groundbreaking research, right? It's not supposed to be easy.
Definitely not. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about dosing, patient compliance, product consistency, and placebo control. But there's one more aspect of clinical trial design that I want to touch on, and that's the consideration of special populations.
Right, because not all clinical trials are created equal.
Exactly, and when you're dealing with certain populations like children or pregnant women, there are additional ethical and logistical considerations that come into play.
For sure. I mean, with children, for example, you have to get consent from the parents or guardians, and you have to make sure that the trial is designed in a way that is safe and appropriate for their age and developmental stage.
Right, and with pregnant women, you have to consider the potential risks to both the mother and the fetus.
Exactly. So these are all really important factors that researchers have to take into account when they're designing clinical trials for cannabinoid therapies.
So it's not just about the science, it's about ethics and safety too.
Absolutely. It's about doing research in a way that is responsible and protects the well-being of the participants.
And that's ultimately what's most important, right?
It is, at the end of the day, we want to develop therapies that are safe, effective, and accessible to everyone who needs them.
Well said. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about some of the unique challenges of designing clinical trials for cannabinoid therapies, from dosing variability to patient compliance to placebo control.
We've got a good foundation now.
We do, and in the next part, we're going to delve even deeper into this fascinating world. We're going to talk about some of the specific conditions that are being studied, the potential benefits and risks of cannabinoid therapies, and the exciting future of this field.
Can't wait to dive in.
Me too. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. Okay, so we're back and ready to continue our deep dive into clinical trials for cannabinoid therapies. And before the break, we were talking about special populations like children and pregnant women and how there are extra things to think about when you're designing trials for these groups.
Right, you have to be extra careful because you're dealing with people who are more vulnerable.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, what are some of the specific challenges that researchers face when they're trying to study cannabinoid therapies in these populations?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is simply finding enough participants.
Okay, so like recruitment is an issue.
It can be, especially for pediatric trials, because parents are often hesitant to enroll their children in studies involving cannabis.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, there's still a lot of stigma around cannabis, and I think a lot of parents would be worried about the potential risks.
Right, and those concerns are valid, but it's important to remember that not all cannabinoids are psychoactive.
Well,
Like CBD, for example, doesn't get you high.
so it's not like you're giving kids THC.
Exactly, and there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that CBD could be really beneficial for certain conditions like epilepsy.
So there's a lot of potential there, but it's tough to get people on board.
It is, but researchers are working hard to educate parents and dispel some of those myths and misconceptions.
And I guess it's also about designing trials that are specifically tailored to the needs of these populations, right?
Absolutely, you can't just take a trial that was designed for adults and apply it to children or pregnant women.
You have to adjust the dosing, the formulations, the outcome measures, everything.
Exactly. And you also have to be extra careful about monitoring for side effects because these populations might be more susceptible.
Right, so it's a lot more complicated.
It is, but it's also really important because if we want to develop safe and effective cannabinoid therapies for everyone, we need to include these populations in our research.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the specific conditions that are being studied. I mean, what are some of the areas where cannabinoid therapies are showing the most promise?
Well, one area that's really exciting is chronic pain.
Oh, yeah, I've heard a lot about that. I mean, cannabis has been used for pain relief for centuries, right?
It has, and there's now a growing body of scientific evidence to support those anecdotal reports.
Like, what kind of pain are we talking about here?
Well, it can be anything from neuropathic pain to inflammatory pain to cancer pain.
So, like a wide range of conditions.
Exactly. And the research suggests that cannabinoids could be really helpful for managing these types of pain.
And what about other conditions? What else is being studied?
Well, another big area is multiple sclerosis.
Oh, wow. So like a neurological condition.
Exactly. MS is a really debilitating disease that affects the central nervous system, and there's some evidence that cannabinoids could help to manage some of the symptoms like muscle spasticity and pain.
So like improving quality of life for people with MS.
Exactly. And then there's also a lot of research going on in the area of cancer.
Really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's a newer area of research, but it's really promising. There's some evidence that cannabinoids could help to reduce nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy.
Oh, wow. So like helping people cope with the side effects of treatment.
Exactly. And there's even some early evidence suggesting that cannabinoids might have anti-tumor properties.
Oh, wow. So like actually fighting the cancer itself?
It's still early days, but it's definitely an area to watch.
So it sounds like there's a lot of potential here. I mean, a lot of different conditions that could potentially be treated with cannabinoid therapies.
There is, but it's important to remember that we're still in the early stages of research. We need more clinical trials to confirm these findings and to figure out the optimal doses and formulations.
Right, because it's not just about whether or not cannabinoids work. It's about how they work and for whom.
Exactly. We need to understand the nuances of these therapies so that we can use them safely and effectively.
And I guess that's where clinical trials come in, right?
Yeah.
They're the key to unlocking the full potential of these treatments.
They are. Without clinical trials, we're just shooting in the dark.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the potential risks of cannabinoid therapies. I mean, obviously with any medication, there are potential side effects. So what are some of the things that people should be aware of?
Well, one of the most common side effects of cannabinoids is drowsiness.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, people often associate cannabis with feeling relaxed and sleepy.
Right, and that can be a good thing if you're using it for insomnia, but it can be a problem if you're trying to drive or operate machinery.
So like anything else, it's about using it responsibly.
Exactly. And then another potential side effect is dry mouth.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that cotton mouth.
That's the one. It's not usually a serious side effect, but it can be annoying.
And what about more serious side effects? Are there any concerns there?
Well, there are some potential risks that people should be aware of. Like, for example, high doses of THC can sometimes trigger anxiety or paranoia.
Oh, wow. So it can actually have the opposite effect of what you're hoping for.
It can, especially in people who are predisposed to those
This
conditions.
is really important to start low and go slow.
Exactly. And to be aware of your own individual response to cannabinoids.
And I guess it's also important to talk to your doctor, right? I mean, if you're considering using cannabinoid therapies, you should definitely consult with a healthcare professional.
Absolutely. They can help you to weigh the potential risks and benefits and make sure that it's the right choice for you.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the potential benefits, and the potential risks of cannabinoid therapies. But I want to end on a positive note and talk about the future of this field.
Mhm.
What are you most excited about when you think about where this research is headed?
Well, one thing that really excites me is the potential for personalized medicine.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. Like tailoring treatments to an individual's specific needs.
Exactly, because we're all different and we all respond to medications differently.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. And with cannabinoid therapies, there's a huge opportunity to personalize treatment based on individuals' unique endocannabinoid system.
Okay, remind me what the endocannabinoid system is again.
Sure, it's basically a complex network of receptors and enzymes that are found throughout the body, and they play a role in a wide range of physiological processes, including pain, mood, appetite, sleep, and immunity.
So like a master regulator of sorts.
Exactly. And the endocannabinoid system is different in everyone. So what works for one person might not work for another.
So the idea is to figure out how to target those specific receptors and enzymes to create more effective and personalized treatments.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research going on in that area right now, trying to develop new drugs that can interact with the endocannabinoid system in very specific ways.
Oh, wow. So like a whole new generation of cannabinoid therapies.
Exactly. And I think that's what's most exciting about this field. The potential is just enormous.
So it's not just about cannabis anymore. It's about understanding the endocannabinoid system and how we can modulate it to improve human health.
It is. And that's a really powerful concept.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive so far. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of clinical trial design to the potential risks and benefits of cannabinoid therapies to the exciting future of personalized medicine. And in the next part, we're going to wrap things up by talking about some of the broader implications of this research for society as a whole.
Yeah, where do we go from here?
Exactly. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break.
And we are back for the final part of our deep dive on clinical trials for cannabinoid therapies. So much interesting stuff we've already talked about.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It does. I'm totally fascinated by this whole field now. But before the break, we were talking about personalized medicine and how that could revolutionize the way we use cannabinoid therapies. So I want to pick up right there. I mean, what are some of the other big picture implications of this research? Like, how could it change the face of healthcare as we know it?
Well, I think one of the most profound implications is that it's forcing us to rethink the way we approach drug development.
Oh, really?
How so? Well, traditionally, drug development has been very much a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
You develop a drug that targets a specific receptor or enzyme, and you hope that it works for everyone.
Right, kind of like a shotgun approach.
Exactly. But with cannabinoid therapies, it's becoming increasingly clear that that approach isn't going to cut it.
Because everyone's endocannabinoid system is different. Exactly. And so we need to develop more targeted therapies that take those individual differences into account.
So it's like moving from a shotgun to a sniper rifle.
Precisely. And that's a really exciting prospect because it means that we could potentially develop treatments that are much more effective and have fewer side effects.
And that could have huge implications for all sorts of conditions, right?
Yeah.
Not just the ones we've already talked about.
Absolutely. I mean, think about all the chronic diseases that we struggle to treat effectively with traditional medication.
Like heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes.
Exactly. Those are all conditions that could potentially benefit from cannabinoid therapies that are tailored to the individual patient.
So it's like opening up a whole new frontier in medicine.
It is, and it's really exciting to be a part of it.
So what are some of the things that need to happen to make this vision a reality? I mean, what are the next steps in terms of research and development?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges we face is a lack of funding.
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
I can imagine that's a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, cannabis research has been historically underfunded.
It has, but that's starting to change slowly but surely as more and more people become aware of the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids.
So there's hope on the horizon.
There is. We just need to keep pushing for more research and more funding.
And what about the regulatory landscape? I mean, I know that cannabis is still illegal at the federal level in the U.S., so how does that impact research and development?
Well, it definitely makes things more complicated.
I bet. Like it's hard to get approval for clinical trials?
It can be, but there are ways to work around it. Like, for example, a lot of the research is being done in states where cannabis is legal.
Okay, so like California, Colorado.
Exactly. And then there are also some federal programs that are starting to support cannabinoid research.
It's not impossible.
It's not, it's just more challenging than it would be if cannabis were legal at the federal level.
Right, but hopefully that will change someday.
I hope so too.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, but let's end on a positive note. I mean, what are you most optimistic about when you think about the future of cannabinoid therapies?
Well, I'm optimistic that we're going to see a lot more research in the coming years, and that research is going to lead to the development of new and innovative treatments for a wide range of conditions.
So like a whole new arsenal of tools for doctors and patients.
Exactly. And I'm also optimistic that we're going to see a shift in public perception as more and more people become educated about the science behind cannabinoids.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still a lot of stigma and misinformation out there.
There is, but I think that's starting to change. And as more and more people share their positive experiences with cannabinoid therapies, I think we're going to see a real tipping point.
So like a snowball effect.
Exactly. And I think that's going to lead to greater acceptance and ultimately to greater access to these therapies for everyone who needs them.
Well, I'm definitely feeling optimistic after this conversation. I mean, it's been really inspiring to hear about all the amazing work that's being done in this field.
It is an exciting time to be involved in cannabinoid research.
It is, and I'm so grateful that you could join us today and share your expertise with our listeners.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of clinical trials for cannabinoid therapies. It's a complex and rapidly evolving field, but one that holds immense promise for the future of medicine. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep those questions coming. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.